Welcome back to Secret Speaks. How has your day been? Now let's uncover the mystery hidden in today's story. I am Maggie Collins, the woman who built Collins Hardware nail by nail with my late husband, only to be erased by my own son and daughter-in-law who said I was nothing but a burden. They tore down my pictures, signed contracts behind my back, and laughed when I brought bread on my birthday. But when I laid the ownership papers on the banker's desk, the law spoke for me. Today, the store stands under a new banner, Back to Integrity, and a plaque that reads, Maggie's Corner, so no one will ever forget who truly built it. On the morning of my 66th birthday, I carried a still warm loaf of banana bread in both hands as I pushed open the glass door of Collins Hardware and Supply in Springfield, Illinois. The sun outside was already heavy with the kind of summer heat that made the air ripple above the asphalt, but inside the store the fluorescent lights hummed with their usual indifference. I had baked the bread the night before the way I always did, a quiet tradition to remind my family that even though I no longer worked behind the counter, I was still here. I told myself maybe today would be different. Maybe Daniel would look up with that boyish grin he once had. Maybe Vanessa would soften and remember that birthdays mattered. The moment I stepped inside, the scent of sawdust and motor oil wrapped around me like an old blanket. The shelves stretched high-lined with bolts and paint cans, the same aisles Walter and I had built together more than 30 years ago. I paused to steady my hands, the wax paper around the bread slick with condensation. At the counter, Daniel was bent over a stack of invoices, pen scratching quickly across the paper. Vanessa stood beside him, her posture sharp, her eyes scanning the numbers as if the world depended on them. Neither of them lifted their heads. I cleared my throat gently and placed the loaf on the counter right at the edge of their papers. My voice sounded softer than I meant when I said I had brought banana bread still warm. For a flicker of a moment, I thought Vanessa might acknowledge the gesture. Her lips pressed together, then curved in something like a smile, but without warmth. She straightened, turned her gaze on me, and her voice cut through the air so every customer could hear. This isn't a charity. You're not an owner anymore. The words hit me harder than a slap. I felt heat rise into my cheeks and my ears burned. Daniel's pen froze mid-stroke. His eyes darted up for a second, then fell back to the invoices. He said nothing. The young cashier, Ryan, shifted uncomfortably by the register, and the customer holding a bag of screws pretended to study the wall display. My throat tightened, but I forced a smile, a small trembling curve meant to hide the sting. I looked at Daniel, waiting for him to defend me, to speak even one word that might soften what had just been said. He kept his eyes on the paper, shoulders hunched as if the invoices were more important than the woman who had raised him. I wanted to remind him of the mornings when he sat on this very counter swinging his legs while Walter showed him how to count nails by the pound. I wanted to tell Vanessa that this building was built nail by my husband's hands and mine, that every shelf, every strip of paint carried our sweat. Instead, I folded my hands tightly together to stop their shaking. Vanessa picked up the loaf, held it as though it were a trinket from a stranger, then set it down with a dull thud on the counter. She turned back to the paperwork and dismissed me as if I were invisible. The silence around me swelled. The lights hummed louder, the register beeped as Ryan finished a sale, shoes squeaked against the tile. My heart thudded heavy in my chest. I turned slowly and let my eyes travel across the store. The hammers hung neatly on their hooks, the paint cans gleamed in neat stacks, the plumbing supplies stood in quiet rows. This was the place where Walter and I spent nights on ladders, hanging signs, painting shelves, polishing glass. We had opened this store when Daniel was a boy of 9. Now it felt like I was trespassing in my own history. I wanted to say it was my birthday to explain that the bread was not charity, but love, but pride sealed my lips. If they could not see me, no words would matter. I swallowed hard against the tears threatening to rise. No one stopped me when I walked to the door. Daniel kept his eyes down, Vanessa's pen scratched. Ryan busied himself with receipts. The customer walked out ahead of me, whistling softly as if nothing had happened. I stepped into the heavy sunlight, and the heat pressed flat against my skin. The parking lot shimmered with waves rising from the asphalt. I walked to my car, each step slow, the keys cold in my palm. When I sank into the driver's seat, I rested my hands on the steering wheel and let the silence engulf me. I did not cry. I did not speak. But inside, I felt something shift, something heavy and unyielding. The loaf of banana bread sat forgotten on the counter behind me, a small offering turned into a symbol of rejection. As I drove away, I passed the old oak tree at the corner of Sycamore Avenue. Walter had once tied a banner there the day we opened the store. Neighbors had come with folding chairs and lemonade, clapping us on the back, telling us that we had brought something solid to the town. I remembered his laughter that afternoon, the way his eyes glowed with pride. The memory stung now like salt on an open wound. Traffic lights flicked from green to red, and I slowed, watching a group of teenagers on bicycles dart across the intersection. They reminded me of Daniel at that age, racing up and down these same streets, calling out to me to watch him. I wondered how the boy I knew had turned into the man who could not lift his head to speak for his own mother. When I pulled into my driveway, the house looked smaller than I remembered, paint peeling at the edges of the porch. The air felt cooler in the shade of the tall sycamores, yet inside me the heat of humiliation still burned. I sat there with the engine off, listening to cicadas droning in the trees, hands gripping the wheel as if it might steady me. I knew something had ended that morning. It was more than a birthday ignored. It was the moment my son and his wife declared that I no longer belonged, the first stroke of erasure in a story that had once been mine. A week later, I pushed open the door of Collins Hardware again, the bell chiming faintly above me. The morning was cooler than the last time I had stood here, but my chest tightened as if the air itself remembered the humiliation I carried out of this place. I stepped inside with the hope, small as it was, that maybe something would feel familiar again. Instead, the wall that had once greeted every customer with photographs of our beginnings now looked bare. Where Walter's grin had hung in a black frame, where my younger self had laughed beside a row of neighbors at our first Christmas sale, where Daniel at 12 had balanced a broom twice his height, there was nothing but a laminated poster about seasonal discounts. I stood there longer than I should have, my eyes searching for the faint nail marks where the frames had been. The wall seemed stripped of its soul. My hand lifted almost of its own accord and brushed the empty space, fingertips grazing paint that still bore faint outlines of rectangles that had once held our story. Ryan was at the register, his youthful face paling as he noticed me staring. He ducked his head, but I walked toward him. I asked quietly what had happened to the photographs. His shoulders shifted, and he said almost in a whisper that Vanessa thought it was time for a more modern look. He added nothing more, eyes down, cheeks burning red. I nodded, though every muscle in me resisted. The ache in my chest deepened. Those photos had not just been decoration. They had been proof that this store was built on hands that belonged to me and Walter, a family effort that no advertisement could replace. Now they were gone as if we had never existed. I walked further inside. My eyes drifted to the wall where plaques once glimmered polished brass, engraved with names of employees who had poured themselves into the store. Many of those plaques bore my own name from years when Walter and I had worked long nights and early mornings. That section now wore a fresh coat of beige paint, smooth and cold. The wall looked lifeless, as if memory itself had been scrubbed away. I made my way toward the back office. My heart beat harder with every step, though my face held steady. Daniel was seated at the desk, hair falling forward as he bent over another stack of papers. Vanessa sat opposite him with her laptop, her fingers tapping quickly, her nails clicking like tiny hammers. The air smelled faintly of toner and dust. Vanessa looked up when I entered and smiled, but the smile carried no welcome. Daniel barely acknowledged me, his eyes fixed on the page. I asked him calmly why the photographs had been taken down. He shifted uncomfortably and said it was part of rebranding. Customers did not care about old pictures, he added. Vanessa's voice slipped in quick and cutting, saying the plaques had been clutter, that modern customers wanted a cleaner look. I stared at Daniel, searching his face for any trace of disagreement. He avoided my eyes. He picked up a pen and signed the top page in front of him, as if that stroke of ink could erase me entirely. I stepped closer to the desk. My eyes caught the heading at the top of the paper. Staff Directory Revision. My stomach sank. I scanned the list and found my name missing. I asked softly if this meant I was being erased from the official record. Daniel cleared his throat and said it was only for clarity, since I was no longer part of daily operations. His words sounded rehearsed, as though Vanessa had drilled them into him beforehand. Vanessa closed her laptop with a crisp snap and said this was the way forward, that nostalgia was not strategy, that the store needed a future, not a past. Daniel signed another page. The air conditioner hummed above us, but to me the room felt stifling. I remembered standing in this very office years earlier, Walter by my side, watching Daniel count receipts with the excitement of a boy learning to be part of something bigger. Back then, I dreamed that one day he would carry on our legacy with pride. Now I watched him sign away my presence as if it were nothing but an old logo to be discarded. I steadied my voice as I said, I understood times change, but family history matters. Daniel finally looked up, his eyes dull with fatigue, and said he needed to focus on the future. He did not see the tears pooling in mine, or perhaps he chose not to. Vanessa sat back in her chair, arms crossed, satisfaction plain on her face. I turned and walked out. My shoes clicked against the tile, the sounds echoing in the hollow space of a store that no longer felt like home. Customers moved along the aisles, unaware of the storm inside me. To them, the store looked efficient, clean-stocked. To me, it was stripped bare, soulless, every trace of Walter and me buried under posters and spreadsheets. When I stepped outside, the sunlight felt harsher. The parking lot stretched wide and empty, the asphalt shimmering. I reached my car, the metal handle hot against my palm, and stood there for a moment staring at the building that once carried my pride. They had not only ignored me, they had begun rewriting the story of Collins Hardware without me in it. As I sat in the driver's seat, I could almost hear Walter's voice, low and steady, reminding me that foundations matter more than paint. The ache of loss twisted with a pulse of something sharper, something like resolve. My hands trembled, but my eyes hardened. They thought they could erase me. They had forgotten who built the very ground they were standing on. I turned the key, the engine humming beneath me, and let the thought settle deep in my chest. This was not the end. Not yet. When I pulled into the driveway on Sycamore Avenue, the house looked exactly the same from the outside. The white paint on the railing chipped the tall trees, casting long shadows across the porch, but inside me everything felt altered. I set my purse down on the kitchen table and let the silence swallow me. Walter's photograph hung by the door, his smile caught forever in that frame. I touched the edge of the glass, whispering a greeting I had spoken countless times since the day he left me in 2018. I sat in his old chair, the fabric worn smooth by years of use, and let memories wash over me. I could see us in 1993 at the flea market with a rickety table covered in mops, light bulbs, and hammers. Walter scribbled prices on scraps of notebook paper and taped them down while I tried to make our little stand look inviting. We ate peanut butter sandwiches and drank from thermoses, laughing when a customer treated a box of nails like a treasure. Those Saturdays were exhausting, full of crumbs. We told ourselves each sale was a break in the foundation of something bigger. By 1995, we had scraped together enough for a narrow storefront on Main Street. The screen door squeaked each time it opened, and we nailed a brass bell above it so we could hear customers even from the back. Daniel was a boy then, running through the aisles, hiding behind buckets of paint, while Walter pretended not to see him. At night when we locked up, we would count the receipts with sore feet and tired smiles, proud of what we had managed to build. That store was more than wood and shelves. It was our marriage, our dream, our gift to our son. When Walter died in October 2018, the leaves turning crimson and gold, I thought my own breath would stop too. I remembered the morning vividly, the coffee cooling in his favorite mug, while I stood frozen, unable to believe the silence in the house. I carried on only because I believed our work deserved to live. For years after I opened and closed the store myself, running it through grief until Daniel returned and said he wanted to help. I thought it was a blessing. I thought God was giving me back some piece of Walter through our son. I could not have imagined that one day they would erase me from it all. The house seemed too quiet. The hum of the refrigerator filled the space where Walter's voice once lingered. I wanted to break the silence to hear laughter again, so I picked up the phone and dialed Daniel. My hands trembled slightly as I waited for him to answer. When his voice came, it was rushed, clipped, as if he was already distracted. I told him I wanted to see Emily after school, that I had baked cookies and bought watercolor brushes to go with the art set she had received for Christmas. There was a pause on the line. Then his voice dropped hesitant, saying it was not a good time. I asked why my chest tightening. He said Vanessa thought it would be better to wait. His words trailed off into silence. I wanted to shout, to demand my right as a grandmother, but instead I only whispered that I missed her. He promised nothing before the line went dead. Hours later, I found myself driving to their neighborhood, a row of houses with neat lawns and flags waving in the breeze. My heart beat harder as I walked up the path to their door, the brushes tucked under my arm like an offering. Vanessa opened the door, her smile thin and cold. She blocked the doorway, her body rigid. Behind her, I heard the faint sound of a cartoon, then a burst of Emily's laughter, bright and familiar. My heart leapt. I stepped forward, but Vanessa did not move aside. She said the timing was not right, that Emily had too much going on, that the tension at the store made visits complicated. Then she delivered the words like a blade. Grandma causes trouble at the store. Her eyes narrowed as if she enjoyed the cut. I begged her to let me at least hand Emily the brushes. After a long pause, she extended her hand. I pressed the bag into her palm, my fingers brushing against hers, cold and unyielding. I tried to see past her into the hallway. For a split second, I saw Daniel standing in the shadows, arms folded. Our eyes met. I searched his face for the boy who once begged to stay late at the shop to help his father, but all I saw was a man too afraid to stand up. He lifted a hand in a half wave and then let it drop. I left without a word. My shoes crunched on the gravel path as I walked back to my car. The sound of Emily's laughter still echoed in my ears, cruel in its distance. I sat behind the wheel, staring at the neat houses around me, their shutters painted in cheerful colors, their porches decorated with potted flowers. My chest ached so deeply it felt hard to breathe. I drove without thinking the road carrying me to the riverside park. Families filled the fields, children chasing soccer balls while parents clapped from fold-out chairs. My eyes scanned the crowd until I saw her. Emily, hair pulled back in a ponytail, running across the grass with determination that made my heart swell with pride. She looked taller than the last time I held her, older somehow. I raised a hand, though I knew she could not see me from this distance. A moment later, Vanessa appeared at my side, her arms crossed tight. Her voice was calm but sharp, as she said this was not the place that Emily needed consistency, that my presence would only confuse her. I said softly that I only wanted to wave to let her know I was here. Vanessa shook her head, stepping closer, forming a wall between me and the field. I stayed there another minute, listening to the laughter, the clapping, the calls from parents. My eyes followed Emily as she kicked the ball, her face flushed with joy. Then I turned back toward the parking lot, my steps heavy, each one a surrender I had not chosen. When I reached home, I set my keys on the table and walked to the living room. The photographs on the mantel stared back at me. Walter's smile in the center, Emily's school portrait beside it. I touched the frame of Emily's picture, whispering an apology I did not owe. Tears welled up and fell silently. I thought of the afternoons when she sat at my kitchen table, coloring, her hands sticky from lemonade, and the winter nights when she curled against me under a quilt, listening to Walter tell stories about building the store. Those memories pressed hard against the fresh wound of being told I was trouble, someone to keep away. I paced the room, footsteps echoing. I felt like a ghost in my own family, remembered only in photographs, not in the present. I opened the closet where boxes of old receipts and notes from the early years of the store were stacked. I ran my hands over the lids but did not open them. Instead, I let the rough cardboard steady me. Those boxes held proof that I was not a shadow. Evening settled outside, the cicadas humming in the trees. I pulled Walter's old Afghan around my shoulders and sat in his chair. The house glowed briefly with the fading light, and I thought of how much of myself had already been stripped away by Vanessa's words and Daniel's silence. Yet beneath the grief, something sharper grew, something unyielding. They could keep me from the store. They could keep me from birthdays and soccer games. But they could not erase the truth of who built the life they were living. They had not just pushed me aside as a grandmother. They were trying to sever me from my own legacy. That thought burned hotter than sorrow. When the sky darkened fully, I closed the curtains. The house returned to stillness, but inside me a different stillness had taken root. It was not resignation. It was resolve. I woke the next morning with a dull ache behind my eyes, the kind that comes from too many tears held back, and I knew I could not stay locked in the house. The quiet of Sycamore Avenue had turned from comfort into suffocation. I told myself I only needed to pick up a few small things from the store, a broom, maybe a packet of screws, nothing that required conversation. I convinced myself that if I kept my head down, it would be easier, though. Deep down, I knew curiosity had taken root. The bell over the glass door jingled faintly as I stepped back into Collins Hardware. The air was cool but held the same mix of sawdust and oil that always clung to Walter's shirts. I paused, scanning the shelves, almost pretending it was still the store I once knew. But the further I walked, the clearer it became that something had shifted. Displays were arranged differently, signs brighter, but less personal, and there was an unfamiliar sterility to the place. At the register, Ryan was helping a customer load a heavy box of nails. His face lit with polite friendliness, but I caught the quick flicker of nerves when he saw me. I wandered the aisles, placing a few small items in a basket to justify my presence. By the time I returned to the counter, the other customer had left. Ryan started scanning the items quickly. His hands trembled slightly, and that was when I saw it. An invoice lay half hidden beneath a clipboard. The name printed in bold at the top was Samuel's Supply, a vendor we had worked with faithfully for decades. My eyes dropped to the line of numbers and I felt my breath catch. The cost listed for bolts was nearly double what it should have been. My memory of those prices was clear as day. I had ordered from Samuel's Supply enough times to know every figure by heart. I asked casually if prices had gone up that much. Ryan froze the scanner in his hand, still hovering over the broom. He glanced around, making sure no one else was close, then leaned toward me. His voice dropped to a whisper. "Vanessa handles all the contracts now," he said. "She signs new agreements every few months." His eyes darted again to the paper. Sometimes envelopes are delivered directly to her. His lips pressed tightly together as if he regretted speaking, and he quickly finished bagging my items. I thanked him softly and moved toward the back, my stomach tightening. My hands gripped the strap of my purse until my knuckles whitened. Each step carried me past shelves and boxes that seemed to stare back silent witnesses to the years I had given here. I reached the stock room and found Sam Keller leaning over a pallet of paint cans. He looked up, his face lined with age and worry, and gave me a cautious nod. We had worked together for over 20 years, and loyalty had carved trust deep between us. I lowered my voice and asked if things had changed. He exhaled slowly and wiped his hands on his work pants. "Since she took over the orders, nothing feels steady," he admitted. "Money is moving differently. People whisper about another account, one that does not appear in the regular books." He shook his head, eyes narrowing. "No one wants to ask questions. It is safer not to." His words sank heavy in me. Another account. Envelopes. Inflated invoices. The pieces clicked together with an ugly certainty. I thanked him, my voice barely steady, and turned back toward the office. Through the open doorway, I caught sight of Daniel. He was standing at his desk, papers clutched too tightly in his hands. He looked up and saw me. For a moment I thought he might come forward, speak, explain. But his eyes shifted quickly away and his shoulders hunched. His fingers fumbled with the document's edges, crumpling as he tried to smooth them. He slipped back into the office, avoiding me entirely. My chest tightened. The image of my son, the same boy who once balanced on stools behind the counter while Walter showed him how to tally receipts, now avoiding my gaze as though I were a stranger, cut me deeper than Vanessa's cruelest words. He knew something. His silence screamed it louder than any confession. I stood rooted there, the hum of the lights above droning in my ears, and for the first time the suspicion took full shape. Vanessa was not simply erasing my presence from the store. She was bleeding money out of it, hiding behind contracts and fake smiles, and Daniel, my own child, was letting her do it. Whether by fear or weakness, he was complicit. I walked slowly back toward the front, passing stacks of lumber and boxes of plumbing supplies. Customers browsed quietly, unaware of the storm raging in my chest. I carried the broom and the bag of screws, but in truth what weighed most was the knowledge pressing down on me. Outside, the afternoon sun blazed mercilessly, the heat shimmering across the black top. I reached my car, hands trembling as I unlocked the door. I sat with the broom across the passenger seat, staring through the windshield at the sign above the entrance. Collins Hardware. My name, Walter's name, carved into the identity of that building. Yet inside it felt as though strangers were writing a new story, one that erased us entirely. I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles pale, and took a long breath. I could hear Walter's steady voice in my mind, reminding me that numbers do not lie, that figures tell the truth if you watch them closely. I thought of the envelopes Ryan had whispered about, the second account Sam had warned of Daniel's downcast eyes. A chill ran through me despite the heat. This was no longer about being left off a staff directory or seeing photographs stripped from walls. This was theft. This was betrayal hiding in plain sight. The cicadas droned in the trees as I drove slowly back to Sycamore Avenue, the broom sliding against the seat with each turn. Every corner of Springfield looked the same as it always had: children on bikes, neighbors mowing lawns, flags fluttering from porches. But for me, the world had shifted. My family's legacy was not only under attack emotionally, it was being drained dollar by dollar by the very people who should have protected it. I pulled into my driveway and shut off the engine, sitting there as the weight of realization settled. I could almost feel Walter beside me, steady and patient, urging me not to look away. My suspicion was no longer just a whisper. It was a truth demanding to be faced. I woke before sunrise with the kind of restless clarity that does not let you hide under a quilt. The house on Sycamore Avenue was quiet except for the refrigerator and the distant hiss of sprinklers switching on up the block. I made coffee and did not drink it. My hands knew where to go before my mind had fully formed the thought. Down the hall into the small room that smelled faintly of paper and old glue toward the metal cabinet Walter hauled home from an auction in the 90s. He used to joke that it would outlive us all. It had. The key was still tucked where I had left it years ago, behind a loose molding above the closet shelf. Cold metal against my palm steadied me. The lock clicked, the drawer dragged open, and the scent of old paper rose like the past breathing. Inside lay manila folders arranged by year in Walter's careful block letters: 1993, 1998, 2003. My name written smaller on the corners in his handwriting, a quiet habit that never failed to make me smile. I carried an armful to the kitchen table and spread them out under the overhead light. Receipts, vendor applications, a small stack of bank authorizations. I touched each with 2 fingers the way you rest your hand on a friend's shoulder. Then my gaze caught the folder that mattered: 1993. I slid the papers free, and there it was, the page with the state seal pressed into it. Collins Hardware and Supply, an Illinois limited liability company. Principal owner Margaret Collins. Registered agent Margaret Collins. I felt the table steady under my forearms as I leaned in. The notary's stamp had bled a faint halo of blue around the edge. Walter's signature sat beside mine, black ink that had not faded as much as I expected. For a long moment, I simply breathed and let what I was seeing take root. I had believed that stepping back from daily work meant relinquishing everything. I had believed Daniel when he said he would handle the paperwork, and I had believed the silence that followed. But the state of Illinois had never been asked to erase me. The paper said I was still here. The paper said I had never left. I turned the next page and found the operating agreement with our signatures and the dates of adoption. An amendment from 1998 changed nothing about ownership, only a line, adding a small credit facility when we outgrew our first space. A later filing in 2003 updated the registered address when we moved across town into the larger storefront with proper parking. There was no assignment of membership, no transfer of interest, no signature that made me a footnote. My name sat in the center of each page, solid and ordinary, as if it belonged there. Tears came and surprised me with how hot they felt. They were not only grief or rage, they were recognition. Relief loosened something tight inside my chest. I pressed my fingertips to the notary's seal and felt its slight ridge. That seal meant more than a wall of photographs or a staff list ever could. It was the floor under the shelves, the studs behind the drywall. It was the part that carried weight. I kept going. The banking folder contained signature cards from years when we still visited the branch to renew them in person. Owner and authorized signer Margaret Collins. Another card from when online banking was new and confusing listed me again with a neat line where Walter had written, "Remember your password," in his impossible tidy script. The small reserve account we kept for slow winters had my name on it. Payroll held my authorization too. I checked each number against the numbers in my memory. No mention of another account. If a second account existed, it had not been authorized by any document I could find. The thought sent a cold thread down my spine, even as the truth in my hand set a fire building. I reached into the bottom drawer of the cabinet where deeds and leases lived. The lease from 2010 identified the tenant as Collins Hardware and Supply and named me as the signatory. Insurance policies listed the store with my name as loss payee. A county tax bill carried my name again. The stack of proof grew until the kitchen table looked like a scaled-down archive of our life's work. Memory pulled me back to the day we filed in 1993. We had ridden the bus to the Secretary of State because the truck needed brakes. Walter wore his good shirt and kept smoothing it like he was about to meet the governor. He insisted my name go first. Titles matter when people start forgetting, he had said later, over cheap burgers, not because of pride, but because people get amnesia when money shows up. He had grinned and raised his paper cup of cola, and I had rolled my eyes and pretended not to be moved. Now, decades later, the truth of his insistence stood between me and the void Vanessa was trying to create. I stacked the most important pages into a fresh folder and wrote my name on a new tab in clear block letters. Then I added the operating agreement, the lease signature page, a recent tax bill, the old bank signature cards. One by one, they slid into place like bricks in a wall. My breathing evened out with the rhythm. I began a list on a notepad next to the folder. Secretary of State verification, bank signatory confirmation, landlord contact, insurance endorsement check, vendor account review. Each line looked like a step I could actually take. The phone sat on the counter across the room. I thought of calling Daniel and asking him to meet for lunch. I imagined how the conversation would go. He would say there was confusion. He would ask me not to escalate. Vanessa would appear in the doorway behind him and tilt her head in that careful way that said I was sentimental and in the way. I set the phone back down. There was no need to argue without facts lined up on the table. I had the first set. I would collect the others. The house felt different as the morning tilted toward noon. The same light fell through the same kitchen window, yet the rooms seemed to stand taller. I poured the cold coffee down the sink and brewed a fresh pot, and this time I drank it. I ate toast at the table with the documents like quiet companions. When I was done, I slipped everything into a canvas tote added my notepad and a pen, then tucked the bag under the chair by the door as if it were a suitcase for a small but important journey. I walked through the house touching things the way you touch souvenirs after a long trip just to remind yourself you have returned. Walter's tape measure on the ledge, the framed photograph of our first store opening the brass bell above the old door glinting in sunlight. Emily's drawing of a blue house and 3 stick figures that had been magneted to the fridge since kindergarten. My eyes lingered on that one until my throat tightened again. I could not control who stood between me and my granddaughter. I could control whether I stood between my family and a lie. By mid-afternoon, the cicadas had begun their slow chorus in the sycamores. I carried the tote back to the table and laid the top document out one more time. The notary seal caught the light. I rested my palm over my name. Then I said it aloud to the empty room for Walter and for myself. They thought I was powerless, but the law says otherwise. The words were not loud. They did not need to be. They settled in my chest and steadied my breathing. I slid the paper back into the folder and closed it with care. Outside, a neighbor's lawnmower buzzed across grass, and someone laughed down the block. The house returned to its normal sounds. I stood and turned off the kitchen light. The next steps would come in the morning when offices opened and clerks answered phones and files were pulled from drawers that looked a lot like mine. For now, I let the quiet settle around me not as defeat, but as a pause before action, the kind of pause a person takes before lifting something heavy that belongs to her. The next day, the air felt heavy and bright, the kind of August morning that presses down even before noon. I carried the tote bag with the folder tucked inside like armor, but instead of heading to the store, I steered the car toward the edge of Springfield where the streets flatten into strip malls. The name Bright West Solutions had stared at me from an inflated invoice, and I wanted to see with my own eyes what kind of business justified such numbers. The address pointed to a row of shops between a frozen yogurt counter and a nail salon. Nothing about it looked like a supplier. I parked 2 rows back, angled the car just so, and rolled the window down an inch. The smell of asphalt rose in waves. I told myself to be patient. After 20 minutes of watching ordinary people carry out bags of groceries, the familiar SUV slid in. Vanessa stepped out, sleek as ever, sunglasses hiding her eyes, a thin white envelope tucked under her arm. She walked quickly to a storefront with a sign that read, Mail and Parcel Center. I held my breath as she went inside. 2 minutes later, she came out empty-handed, checked her phone, and drove off without a glance around her. My pulse quickened. I waited another 5 minutes before I entered the shop. The air smelled of cardboard and printer ink. Behind the counter was a wall of small brass doors, hundreds of them stacked in neat rows. I bought a roll of tape I did not need, then asked the clerk if Bright West Solutions received packages there. He shrugged and said some customers used the boxes for forwarding only and never stepped inside except to drop envelopes. His indifference told me all I needed. Bright West had no warehouse, no employees, no shelves of stock. It was a mailbox. I stepped outside and let the heat hit me full. My throat ached with a mix of anger and grim relief. The company siphoning money from our store was nothing more than a brass slot on a wall. I sat in the car, fingers drumming on the wheel, before pulling out my phone and dialing Evelyn. It had been years since I needed her for more than a holiday card, but hearing her calm voice steadied me. I told her everything the doubled prices the envelopes the mail center. I reminded her of the folder that showed I was still the owner in the eyes of the state. She listened without rushing. "Bring me the papers," she said. We will make a plan. Her office sat above a title company downtown, the kind of building where the carpets always smelled faintly of toner. She looked the same tidy gray bob and deliberate movements. She read my documents in silence and finally tapped the page where my name appeared as principal owner. "This is solid," she said. "If you want to take action, we need more than suspicion about Bright West. We need proof it is a shell." Then she mentioned a private investigator. She trusted someone named Carla Jennings. Carla arrived the next morning in a navy jacket and plain shoes, a woman whose eyes measured a room without seeming to move. She took notes while I described Vanessa's visit to the mail center. She asked for dates, spellings, copies of invoices. I slid the Samuels supply bill across the desk, and she studied the routing numbers as if they were fingerprints. She said shell companies loved bland names, rented addresses, and prepaid accounts. She promised to check state databases' licensing records and watch the strip mall herself. 2 days later, Evelyn called me back to her office. Carla had sent a short report with photographs. Bright West Solutions was registered by a national filing service. Its address the same mail center box I had seen. No payroll, no employees, no equipment purchased, nothing to suggest it was real. Carla had even photographed Vanessa entering at 10:15 with an envelope and leaving at 10:17 with empty hands. Another photo showed a courier delivering padded envelopes to the store office signed for with a name that was not familiar. She had also traced a dissolved logistics company that shared the same filing agent, a company once accused of pocketing deposits. The pattern was there, plain as chalk, on black pavement. I carried the report home and sat at the kitchen table, the folder of ownership papers open beside it. Together they told a story I could not yet prove in court, but knew in my bones was true. Vanessa had built a channel to bleed money from the store dressed up as a supplier, no larger than a mailbox. Later that afternoon, I went to the store determined to see what they would show me. In the office, Daniel stood at the desk, pen in hand, his shoulders stiff. Vanessa leaned over a contract, pointing to a line. I stepped into the doorway quietly. Daniel looked up, froze, and for a moment I thought he would speak. Instead, he lowered his eyes and signed. Vanessa took the paper back, her smile bright and sharp. I caught the header clearly. Bright West Solutions Supply Agreement. My stomach dropped, though my face stayed still. Daniel brushed past me without meeting my eyes, mumbling something about the front counter. His hand trembled slightly on the clipboard. Vanessa opened her laptop and resumed typing as if I were not standing there. She did not look rattled. She believed she was untouchable. I walked back through the aisles. Sam moved a dolly stacked with paint cans, his eyes flicking toward me for only a second. Ryan counted change at the register, his hands shaking just enough to make coins rattle. Customers shopped unaware that the store's lifeblood was being siphoned. The hum of the lights and the scent of lumber pressed down on me. That evening, Evelyn and I spread Carla's photographs across her desk. Images of Vanessa at the mail center of the brass door numbered 68 of the courier signature of the link to the dissolved logistics company. Evelyn tapped her pen against one photo. With your documents and this report, she said, we are close to what a judge will respect. Not close enough yet. We need sworn statements, affidavits, and a clear explanation of how money is at risk of disappearing if we wait. Courts want records, not anger. I nodded, understanding. The picture was strong, but not final. Vanessa was still signing contracts. Daniel was still lowering his gaze. Money was still moving. I told Evelyn I would sign whatever she prepared tomorrow. She promised to draft through the evening and ask Carla for a declaration to attach. When I stepped outside, the sky was painted with the last of the day lavender turning into blue. The courthouse dome caught the final glow. I walked to the car with the tote pressed close to my side. I sat for a while listening to the hum of traffic, the documents beside me heavy with truth, but not yet enough to stop the bleeding. I knew what Bright West was now. I could name it, describe it, picture its brass door. It was not just disrespect or arrogance. It was a scheme built on paper and silence. I gripped the wheel, breathing slowly, and told myself this was the beginning, not the end. The next morning, I dressed carefully the way Walter once did when we had to sit across from bankers in starched shirts. My hands shook a little as I buttoned my blouse, but when I slipped the folder of documents into my tote bag, the weight steadied me. Evelyn drove us downtown to Springfield First Bank, her small sedan humming along Capitol Avenue. She spoke little, her eyes on the traffic, her mind already on the meeting ahead. Inside the bank lobby, the air smelled faintly of polish and coffee. We were shown into an office lined with framed certificates and photos of community events. Martin Lewis rose from behind a wide desk, his suit jacket neat, but his expression cautious. He had known Walter had shaken his hand at Rotary breakfasts, and he looked at me with something that might have been sympathy. I set the folder on his desk and opened it to the original filing from 1993, the operating agreement, the lease signature. Evelyn laid Carla's report beside it. Martin adjusted his glasses and read carefully. He tapped a finger against the seal of the state and nodded. "You are still the principal owner, Mrs. Collins," he said. "That part is beyond question." Relief flickered through me, but he continued before I could breathe too deeply. "Freezing accounts is not a step the bank can take on its own. We require a court order." My throat tightened. I asked how much had moved recently. He looked at the computer screen, his lips pressing together. "I cannot disclose figures without proper authorization," he said. Evelyn leaned forward, her voice crisp, and reminded him that if the owner of record was in front of him, he could at least confirm whether funds were still being withdrawn. Martin hesitated, then said quietly that significant activity had been occurring and that time mattered. He slid the folder back across the desk. "With the right order," he said, "we will follow immediately." Back in the car, Evelyn already had her phone out dictating notes. We drove to the Sangamon County Courthouse, a stone building that rose with solemn weight above the square. Inside, the air was cooler, heavy with echoes of footsteps on marble. Evelyn filled out the emergency petition with practiced efficiency, attaching my affidavit and Carla's declaration. She asked me to sign under oath that I remained the owner and that funds were at risk of being dissipated. My hand trembled slightly as I wrote my name, but the line came out straight. We waited on a wooden bench until a clerk called us into a hearing room. The judge, a man with thinning hair and a direct gaze, looked over the stack of papers Evelyn handed him. He asked questions in a low voice. Was I the same Margaret Collins whose name appeared on the filings from 1993? Yes, I said. Did I believe funds were being moved without my consent? Yes. Could I describe the risk I told him about inflated invoices, about a company that lived inside a mailbox, about my son's silence and my daughter-in-law's signatures? My words felt raw, but steady, anchored by the documents already on his bench. Evelyn added her argument clear and clipped. She explained that delay would allow further transfers, that preservation of funds was essential, that without an order, the rightful owner could suffer irreparable harm. The judge studied the documents again. The clock on the wall ticked. Then he signed his name across the bottom of the order. Temporary restraining order granted. Accounts to be frozen immediately. Further disbursements require the signature of the principal owner, Margaret Collins. I let out a breath I had been holding so long my ribs ached. The gavel did not strike. There was only the sound of the clerk gathering papers. But the decision hung in the air like thunder rolling across flat land. Back at the bank, Martin received us with a solemn nod. He read the order carefully, then called in a manager. Instructions moved quickly down the line. I heard terms like freeze authorization and hold pending review. He finally looked at me and said, "Mrs. Collins, the accounts are now restricted. No checks or transfers will clear without your approval. At present balance, $72,500 has been secured." The number lodged in my chest like a solid stone. That much had been left, which meant more had already gone. I forced myself to focus on the present. I signed the necessary card that restored my authority, and Martin placed a copy of the order in a folder for compliance. He rose, shook my hand with firm gravity, and said, "The law has spoken." Walking out of the bank, the midday light struck hard and white off the sidewalk. My knees felt weak, but my shoulders were straighter than they had been in months. Evelyn walked beside me, her step brisk, but she glanced at me with the faintest curve of a smile. I clutched the tote against me, feeling the papers inside and the echo of the judge's pen still warm in my memory. For the first time since Walter's death, I felt the weight of the store's future rest in my own hands again. Power had been wrestled from me in whispers and signatures, but it had returned in ink and order. As the courthouse clock told the hour, I stood still on the steps, the sound ringing across the square and let myself believe that those hours could still be defended. The courthouse clock nearly struck 3 when I unlocked my front door and set the tote down on the hallway table. My legs still trembled from the long hours of arguments and papers, but my chest carried a steadiness I had not felt in years. I hung up my jacket and let the air of the house settle around me. The scent of coffee grounds lingered from the morning. I walked to the kitchen, poured a glass of water, and was just beginning to sit when the phone rang sharp and insistent. I lifted the receiver and did not even need to hear the first words to know whose fury was waiting. Vanessa's voice exploded through the line, high and jagged, rattling in my ear. "This is our company now," she shouted, each word thrown like a stone. "Do you understand me, Margaret? You think you can march into a bank with your dusty papers and undo everything I have built." Her voice rose, cracked, then steadied again with venom. I gripped the receiver but kept my tone level. "No, Vanessa. You erased me from the walls, but not from the ownership papers. This store is still mine." There was a pause long enough for me to hear her breathing hard on the other end. Then she laughed short and bitter. "You really believe those papers change anything? The customers listen to me. The employees take direction from me. Daniel follows me." She said his name with cruel emphasis, like she was twisting a knife. Out of the corner of my eye, I caught movement. Daniel was standing at the far end of the hallway, half hidden in the shadow near the stairs. He leaned against the frame arms, folded, listening, though he had no right to. His eyes darted to me and then away as if ashamed to be caught. Vanessa was still raging. "You have made yourself a joke," she spat. "You embarrassed your own son in front of the bank. You made us look weak in town. Do you think anyone respects you after this circus?" My hand tightened on the receiver. My voice came calm, slow, each word measured. Respect is not earned through shouting or envelopes dropped at a mailbox. It is built on truth and on years of work. Walter and I built that truth brick by brick, and no amount of your scheming changes it. Her breathing grew ragged. "You will regret this," she hissed. Do you hear me? I will not let you destroy what I created." I closed my eyes for a moment, seeing Walter in his work shirt, seeing the stacks of papers with my name steady in black ink. "You did not create it." I answered, my voice low but firm. "You built shadows. We built the store, and the law knows the difference." There was a sharp click as she slammed the phone down. The line went dead, but the echo of her fury lingered. The silence that followed felt heavier than her shouting. I lowered the receiver slowly and turned. Daniel was still in the hallway. He had pushed off the frame and now stood in the open, his face pale. His lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. He looked at me with eyes full of something torn between shame and fear. Finally, he whispered, "I did not know she would call like that." I said nothing. My silence was its own judgment. He shifted, rubbed the back of his neck, and then moved past me toward the back door. The screen banged as it closed behind him. I was left in the stillness of the house, the weight of his absence pressing as sharply as his presence had. I set the receiver back on its cradle and walked into the living room. Walter's chair stood by the window. I lowered myself into it and let the quiet wrap around me. My pulse still hammered from the call, but underneath the rush of blood, I felt a different current. Vanessa's voice had not been confident. It had cracked. She had revealed fear. The balance had shifted. For months I had been reacting, pushed and erased, but now she was reacting to me. The restraining order, the bank, the judge's signature, all of it had carved a place she could not reach. She could shout. She could threaten. She could lean on Daniel's silence, but she could no longer claim certainty. I stayed in the chair until the sun slid lower and the living room filled with long stripes of orange light. The cicadas outside sang loud, their rhythm steady, reminding me of the summers when Daniel was small and Walter grilled chicken in the yard while Emily toddled around in her sandals. I felt the ache of those days like a bruise, yet alongside the ache, something fierce burned. I rose, walked to the kitchen and filled a glass of water. My reflection in the window looked older than I remembered, but steadier too. The tote bag sat near the door, the folder inside it, a reminder that the fight was not over. Still tonight, I had seen the shift with my own eyes. Vanessa's rage was proof that power had moved. Night pressed gently against the glass as I climbed the stairs. I placed the tote beside my bed, touched the cover once more, and let my hand linger. Tomorrow would bring more battles, more words sharp as knives, but tonight I allowed myself to breathe. For the first time in a long while, I was not invisible. I was not erased. I had become the opponent they had to face. Within a week, the cracks in the store began to show like hairlines in old plaster. Neighbors mentioned them before I saw them for myself. Mrs. Whitaker from the next block stopped me on Sycamore Avenue while watering her roses and said the counter staff at Collins Hardware looked overwhelmed. She waited 20 minutes for a gallon of paint that used to be mixed in 10. I smiled politely, thanked her, and carried on though my stomach twisted. A few days later, another neighbor, Mr. Jensen, muttered that the lumber delivery he ordered came late and short. He shook his head and said it never used to be this way. When I finally stepped inside the store again, the change was impossible to ignore. Shelves looked disorganized, small items misplaced. A customer near the register argued with Ryan over a charge that had not been honored by a coupon. Ryan's voice cracked with nerves, while Vanessa stood near the office door pretending not to hear. Sam passed by me with a box in his arms, his shoulders heavy, his eyes catching mine briefly with unspoken weariness. I asked Ryan quietly how things were going. He hesitated, then leaned closer and whispered that 2 of the younger clerks had quit after their paychecks arrived 3 days late. He said another was looking for work elsewhere. He rubbed his forehead and added that Vanessa brushed off their questions, saying payroll glitches happened. I remembered the way Walter balanced ledgers down to the penny, refusing to sleep until everything reconciled. This sloppiness was not glitch. It was consequence. Customers began voicing complaints openly. One man slammed his receipt on the counter and said he would take his business to Barker's Tools next time. A woman muttered that she missed the days when she could trust whoever stood behind the counter. Each comment was a stone dropping into water, rippling outward, making other customers glance uneasily around. At church one Sunday, 2 women behind me whispered that the hardware store seemed to be going downhill under new management. They spoke as if I were not there, as if I were already a ghost in the pew. I kept my eyes forward and let the hymns wash over me, but inside I burned with both shame and vindication. I did not have to say a word. The truth was slipping through on its own. Then came the article. A friend handed me a copy of the Springfield Times, and there it was on the second page, the headline in bold, "Collins Hardware in Trouble." The reporter detailed late deliveries, customer complaints, staff turnover. He quoted an unnamed employee saying morale had never been lower. Reading those words, I could almost hear Ryan's trembling voice. The article did not mention Vanessa by name, but the implication was clear. The piece spread quickly. At the grocery store, a cashier asked if I had seen the paper. On my walk home, a neighbor shook his head and said he hoped the place would survive. I nodded, lips pressed tight. Each conversation was both painful and oddly satisfying. Vanessa had spent months scrubbing me from plaques and photos. Now the public was writing her failure into headlines. I stopped by the store midweek to buy screws, and the atmosphere felt heavier than ever. The aisles were quieter, fewer customers browsing. The lights hummed but did not chase away the gloom. Vanessa paced near the back office, her phone pressed to her ear, voice clipped. Daniel stood behind the counter trying to look composed, but his eyes flicked nervously toward the door each time a customer entered. Sam loaded a dolly alone, sweat on his brow. He gave me a faint nod but said nothing. Near the register, a man muttered that Barker's Tools had given him a discount just for bringing up his past loyalty to Collins. Another customer left a half-filled cart near the paint aisle and walked out. The bell on the door jingled in an oddly final way. I stood among the shelves and felt the store groan like an old ship taking on water. That evening, sitting on my porch, neighbors passing by brought the news to me without my asking. They said the Times article was all anyone in town seemed to discuss. One woman said she felt sorry for Daniel. Another said she could not stand Vanessa's arrogance anymore. Their words drifted in with the evening breeze, and I realized how far the narrative had turned. For once, I was not the one insisting on my place. The town itself was telling the story. Inside, I set the newspaper on the kitchen table beside my folder of documents. I stared at the headline again, feeling both sorrow and grim justice. Walter had always said reputation was a slow-growing tree but easy to cut down. Vanessa had swung her axe and thought no one would hear. Now the echoes of her strikes were loud across Springfield. As the cicadas sang outside and the sky deepened into night, I folded the paper carefully and placed it in the tote with the legal filings. The store that Vanessa once paraded as her own triumph was faltering. Customers drifted away. Employees left whispers turned into printed words. The very foundation she had claimed shook under her feet. For the first time, I felt that karma was not a distant hope, but something alive and moving through the town, carrying truth from one doorstep to another. I sat back in Walter's chair and let the thought settle. The house was quiet, the night steady, and in that calm, I knew the tide had shifted beyond Vanessa's control. The day slipped into a long blue evening, and the house on Sycamore Avenue settled around me like a warm blanket. I sat with a cup of tea that had gone cold and watched the streetlights blink on one by one. The newspaper lay folded on the table, its headline, "A Silent Presence in the Room." Tires whispered along the curb. Somewhere a dog barked twice and fell quiet. When the knock finally came, it was soft at first, then more insistent, and I felt the old ache in my chest stir before I even stood. Daniel stood on the porch with his shoulders rounded as if the air itself weighed more than it should. His tie was loose, his shirt creased, his eyes rimmed red. He asked if he could come in, voice low and hoarse. I stepped aside and he crossed the threshold like a man entering a church at midnight. He did not sit. He went to the mantel and stared at Walter's photograph for a long few breaths, then lowered himself onto the edge of the couch, elbows on his knees, hands clenched together as if in prayer. Silence expanded and then contracted. He started to speak in fragments. He said he had signed what Vanessa put in front of him. He said she had told him Bright West Solutions was about modern marketing and vendor optimization, and all the phrases people use when they want speed without questions. He said she had called it a short-term bridge. He said he thought it was temporary. The words sounded thin even as he formed them. I crossed to Walter's chair, reached down into the tote, and placed the copy of the Bright West agreement on the coffee table between us. The pages lay there like bright ice. I turned one with a fingertip until his signature faced him. I told him a signature is not temporary. I told him it is responsibility written in ink. His mouth opened, then closed. He looked down, and the first tear fell. Then the second. Then his shoulders shook, and he pressed his palms to his eyes the way a small boy hides from a storm. The sound of his crying filled the room with a rough human honesty that neither of us had allowed in months. My throat tightened, but I did not move toward him. I had stood aside and softened too many times while silence did harm. There are nights when love must be steady and hard. He tried again between shuddering breaths. He said Vanessa told him the store would collapse without her, that he did not have what it took, that the town was changing faster than we could keep up. He said she told him that good men provided and did not argue, that families stayed whole when husbands agreed. He said she told him if he refused to sign, she would leave, that Emily would be better off, away from people who dragged their feet and worshipped the past. He said these things and could not meet my eyes. He said he had been afraid. I let the words settle, and then I asked the only question that mattered. Did you know it was wrong when you signed? He swallowed and nodded. Not the numbers, he said, not the structure, not all at once. But something in my stomach turned every time, and I pushed that feeling down. I thought of Walter counting receipts with calloused thumbs, of the brass bell above our first door, of Daniel as a boy pushing a broom taller than himself and grinning at every customer who said thank you. I looked at the man on my couch and saw both the boy and the choice. I told him fear explains what we do, but it does not excuse what we sign. I told him he had failed his father's example and his own name. I told him he had chosen quiet comfort over loud truth. He whispered that he was sorry. He said the word again and again until it sounded like a stone skipping across water. He said he would help make it right if I would let him. He said he would stand between Vanessa and the store. He said he would talk to the vendors himself, unwind what could be unwound, sit with Martin at the bank, face anyone I asked him to face. I sat down across from him so that the contract was a small table between us, a line he could not step over. I said he would always be my son. That part was not up for revision. Then I said he was no longer the manager of Collins Hardware and Supply. I said he would not sign another agreement, not direct payroll, not access vendor accounts, not speak for the business in any setting. I said the store's future no longer rested in his hands. He flinched as if the words were a physical thing. He stared at the papers and then at his hands and then at the carpet. He asked if there was any way back. I said not now. I said repentance is a road, not a moment, and that this road started with stepping aside. I said if he wished to be only my son, there was space for that here. If he wished to be the store's heir, that door had closed. Minutes stretched, and the house breathed around us. The clock in the hallway counted its soft measures. Outside, a car door closed somewhere, and a neighbor's porch light clicked off. Daniel rubbed the heel of his hand across his eyes and stood. He wavered, then steadied as if learning how to walk with a new weight. He looked toward Walter's picture again, as if asking it for permission that would not come. He said he loved me. He said he was sorry. The words were small but sincere, and for the first time that night, I let myself believe he meant them. I walked him to the door. He paused on the threshold, the night air pressing cool against our cheeks. He started to say something else and then stopped. He nodded once, almost a bow, and stepped onto the porch. The screen door swung shut with its familiar creak and clap. His footsteps faded down the walk. The street held him a few seconds longer in the oval of the streetlight, then took him. I stood in the doorway and let the night wash over me. The crickets sang their simple chorus. Somewhere a train horn called from far beyond the river. I closed the door and returned to the living room. The contract still lay open, his signature as stark as a scar. I slid the pages back into the folder and held it against my chest for a long moment. Grief moved through me like a tide, and underneath it a steadiness that did not break. I put the folder in the tote and set the tote beside Walter's chair. I turned off the lamp and let the room fall into the soft shadows I knew as well as my own hands. In the window glass, my reflection looked older and also more certain. Love and legacy had parted ways tonight. A mother and a businesswoman had made two different promises and kept both. I walked down the hall to my room, the boards warm under my feet, and allowed myself the small mercy of rest. In the morning, there would be calls to return and documents to sign, and a future to shape one deliberate step at a time. The morning after my conversation with Daniel, I woke to the smell of dew on the sycamores and the heavy silence of a house carrying too many memories. I made coffee and spread the ownership documents across the kitchen table. For the first time, the pages did not feel like proof I had to clutch, but like tools I could wield. I stared at Walter's signature at my own name printed firmly, and I knew it was time to decide what future Collins Hardware deserved. When Evelyn arrived with her briefcase and sharp eyes, I told her plainly that the store could not survive under my family's fractures. It needed steadiness, and I was willing to place it in another's hands if those hands honored its roots. Evelyn nodded once as if she had expected this. She already had a name prepared. Fred Barker. Fred's shop on the east side had been our competitor for years, but the kind of competitor who shook Walter's hand at Rotary breakfasts and once lent us a pallet jack during a holiday rush. He was known for fairness, his receipts always correct, his words steady. By mid-morning, Evelyn and I sat with him at a diner booth, steam rising from our mugs. Fred listened carefully as Evelyn outlined the bank order and the state of inventory. He asked about Sam, about Ryan, about the debts Bright West had left. I told him my conditions without hesitation. Daniel would never again touch the store's management. Vanessa would have no role, no shadow involvement, no influence. And above the counter, a banner must read, "Back to integrity." The town deserved to walk through those doors and believe the price on the tag matched the one at the register. Fred rubbed his jaw thoughtfully, then nodded. He said he would honor those terms, and even more, he would keep Sam if Sam wanted to stay and give Ryan a fair chance with training. Evelyn drafted a simple letter of intent right there on the table, her pen scratching against the paper between salt and sugar shakers. We reviewed numbers adjusted for frozen funds and acknowledged that unwinding fraudulent contracts would take time. When Fred signed his name at the bottom, I felt something settle in my chest. Not triumph, but relief. The days that followed were brisk. Evelyn worked with Martin Lewis at Springfield First Bank, ensuring every transfer would be recognized under the restraining order. The landlord was notified, the insurer contacted. Fred walked the aisles with Sam, noting which suppliers could be trusted. I watched Sam's shoulders ease for the first time in months. Ryan straightened behind the counter when Fred asked him to demonstrate the register system. It was as though hope itself had been stocked on the shelves. By Friday afternoon, we were ready to sign. The bank conference room smelled faintly of polish and copier ink. Martin laid the documents in neat stacks. Evelyn marked tabs for each signature. Fred stood by the window hat in his hand, quiet as ever. I wore Walter's pearls and a simple blue dress, steadying myself with every breath. The door opened just as we began. Vanessa strode in with a folder hugged tight to her chest, Daniel trailing behind with his eyes on the floor. She announced that any sale required her consultation and that she would not stand by while others erased her contribution. Her voice carried sharp and high. I stayed seated. Evelyn slid the court order across the table, the judge's signature plain. Then she placed the original 1993 filings that listed me as principal owner, followed by the bank confirmations restoring my authority. Her voice was level as she explained that lawful ownership rested solely with me, that funds had been preserved by court order, and that no managerial rights existed except those I granted. Those rights had been revoked. Vanessa's face hardened. She turned toward Daniel, but he would not meet her gaze. She muttered that the town would not stand for this, that customers followed her. Martin spoke then, calm and firm, saying the bank would follow the order as written. Fred remained silent, waiting with his hands folded. After a tense pause, Vanessa turned on her heel and left. Daniel lingered a moment, eyes flicking to me with something like apology, then followed her out. The door closed softly and the air eased. We returned to the papers. I signed where Evelyn had marked Fred signed after me. Each stroke of the pen felt like lifting a stone from my shoulders. When the final page was complete, Martin collected the documents with a nod. That was when Fred reached into his bag and pulled out a brass plaque. He set it on the table so I could read the engraving. Maggie's Corner. For the woman who built this. My throat closed and tears blurred my vision. I had not wept through court hearings or bank meetings, but that small square of brass undid me. It was not grief, it was recognition. Someone had chosen to remember to honor what Walter and I had carved out of sweat and long nights. Fred said he would mount it at the front corner where customers often paused to pick up the small items they forgot. He promised that on reopening day, the sign above the counter would read, "Back to Integrity." I touched the plaque with my fingertips, the cool metal anchoring me, and whispered that it was enough. That evening we walked the store together. The light slanted golden through the windows, dust dancing in the beams. Fred moved down each aisle with Sam taking notes on inventory, discussing lead times. Ryan asked if he should call back longtime customers whose orders had been delayed. Fred told him yes, and to be honest, to give real dates and keep them. I stood by the end cap where the plaque would hang and felt pride swell inside me. When Vanessa returned briefly, her eyes flashing, Fred met her with steady calm. He thanked her for stopping by and said the store was already under new stewardship. She tried to challenge Sam and Ryan, but both men stood firm. Daniel lingered outside the door, his posture sagging. After a few sharp words, she turned and left again. The silence she left behind felt lighter than her presence. We locked up at sunset. Fred shook my hand with quiet strength and said he would begin vendor calls at dawn. Evelyn tucked the closing file into her case, promising to send scans before the evening ended. I lingered on the sidewalk, gazing at the store windows glowing in the last light. Behind that glass lived decades of my life, and now a chance for the future to be rebuilt honestly. On the drive home, twilight painted the sycamores in shades of peach and silver. I parked, set my jacket on the chair, and placed the plaque gently on the kitchen table. For a long moment I stood at the window and whispered to Walter that the store would not shame his name. Night fell steady and calm, and for the first time in years, I felt the weight of the town and the law resting beside me, no longer against me. The morning after the signing, I woke to the sound of the phone ringing. Evelyn's voice was calm but firm as she told me the Internal Revenue Service had officially opened an investigation into Bright West Solutions. She explained that an investigator named Thomas Reed had been assigned and that subpoenas would be issued for financial records. I hung up and sat at the kitchen table with the sunlight spilling across the papers. For the first time in months, I felt the wheel of justice begin to turn in a direction I could trust. 2 days later, Reed himself arrived at the bank while I was meeting with Martin. He was tall, with neat gray hair and a steady gaze. He introduced himself, politely displayed his credentials, and explained he was collecting documents regarding vendor payments. He spoke little, but the weight of his words left no doubt. Bright West was more than sloppy bookkeeping. It was fraud. He accepted the copies I handed him of inflated invoices, and he assured me the records would help. As he left, I felt a quiet satisfaction. The law had caught up with the shadow that had stalked my family. Vanessa's absence from the store was swift and total. She no longer stormed the aisles or raised her voice at the counter. Instead, neighbors whispered she stayed inside with blinds drawn, her SUV parked unmoved in the driveway. I heard that Reed had already visited her home, asking questions she could not easily deflect. The same woman who had once tried to erase me from the walls now faced an erasure of her own making, one written in federal ink. Daniel came to see me that week. He knocked softly at dusk, holding his hat in both hands, and asked if he could sit on the porch. His shoulders slumped as he confessed what he had already told Reed. He admitted he had signed documents without reading them, trusting Vanessa's insistence that Bright West was just a marketing partner. He admitted he had been afraid to stand up to her, afraid she would leave and take Emily. His voice broke when he said, "I thought I was protecting my family, but I see now I betrayed it." I listened, my heart torn between sorrow and resolve. I told him the same words I had spoken before. He was my son and always would be, but the store was no longer his. That door had closed. He nodded, tears slipping down his cheeks, and said he would try to earn back trust in smaller ways. He asked if he could come by on Sundays not to talk about business, but to share dinner and help with the yard. I agreed, feeling that perhaps there was still a path forward as mother and son. The brightest moment came not from court orders or investigations, but from Emily. One afternoon, she came bounding up my steps after school, her backpack hanging crooked. She threw her arms around me with sudden force and blurted out a question that startled me. "Grandma, what does dignity mean?" Her eyes were wide, earnest, waiting for an answer. I smoothed her hair and spoke slowly. "Dignity is when you stand firm in who you are, even when others try to erase you. It is when you hold your head up no matter how loud the storm gets." She leaned into me and whispered, "Then I want to have dignity like you." My chest ached with love, and I held her close, knowing the lesson had reached her more deeply than any lecture ever could. The day of the reopening, I stood outside the store with Fred and Sam as the new banner unfurled. "Back to integrity." The words hung clear and bold above the counter inside. Customers streamed through the doors, some pausing to run their hands across the brass plaque, mounted on the corner display, "Maggie's Corner," for the woman who built this. Their smiles and nods carried more than approval. They carried recognition. Sam moved among the aisles steady and proud. Ryan worked the register with a confidence I had not seen in months. Fred shook hands and answered questions, his calm presence grounding the store like a new foundation. I lingered near the entrance, watching people laugh and talk, as though a shadow had finally lifted. No one needed me to explain what had happened. The truth was visible in the service, in the shelves stocked properly, in the absence of fear behind the counter. The community had spoken not with headlines this time, but with their presence. They had returned because they believed again. That evening, I sat on the porch swing, the warm breeze carrying the hum of traffic from Main Street. I looked toward the store, its windows glowing in the twilight, and felt peace slip quietly into me. Walter's memory sat beside me in the creak of the swing and the sycamores swaying. I thought of Daniel beginning the long work of healing. I thought of Emily, her small voice asking about dignity. I thought of the brass plaque, steady and gleaming where anyone could see. The battles had been bitter, the wounds deep, but justice had arrived. Vanessa faced investigators instead of customers. Daniel faced his own reflection. And I at last could face the future with my name intact. The world had tried to erase me. It had failed. If you have ever been pushed aside, dismissed, or told you did not matter yet, found the strength to stand tall and claim your worth, I invite you to share your story. This is Grandma True Stories, where the voices, memories, and resilience of women are heard and honored.